When I opened the Wellness Center back in 1975, I naively thought that people would come in, we would do the wellness evaluation where we could show them all the factors. If their nutrition was bad, their stress levels, they weren't exercising, we could predict. I'm trained in preventive medicine. I want to prevent things and early detection, things like that. No one took us up on it, almost no one, unless they were in pain, unless there was a problem. And all of our money goes into the cure end. So if we just put a little money and attention into the prevention and how we raise babies, that'll prevent the next generation of men from being disconnected and going through all this when their kids are born. But it's a two-pronged thing. We have to deal with our own wounding and grow and improve our own relationships, and ideally provide the needs that babies have that are just not met by conventional culture. And in 1996, I think it was, I wrote an article for our little newsletter called Why Men Leave, Confessions of a Semi-Reformed Workaholic something or other. I don't remember. It was a long string. I was disconnected, and I could sense it, but I didn't know what to do. And I began to actually conversations with Janine Parvati-Baker, where she had described the wounding that she saw with fathers when kids were born and how women lost interest in sex, and for many men that was how they knew they were loved. And if you've been raised in a situation where you're disconnected, you've looked for the mommy you've never had, and you find her and marry her, and you think everything's okay, and she has a baby, suddenly her priorities have radically changed. She probably has the same wounding, but because she has a physical connection from carrying the baby 9 months and hopefully nursing the baby another 2 years, which is the recommended minimum of the World Health Organization, shocks most people, but at least 2 years. And that heals her wounds, or in large part, because she's getting that connection. As my wife said, being a mother healed a lot of her own unmet mothering needs. And for the guy looking on, who doesn't have that level of connection, the better the mother and the baby connect, the more he sees what he didn't get. So the more the father sees his own needs that weren't met, like rubbed in his face, like if the mother sticks the baby in daycare after 3 months and goes back to work, he probably isn't going to notice so much what he didn't get. Of course, you're repeating the cycle again, and I'm not advocating that, but the downside of meeting a baby's needs in a nuclear family, when it takes 3.87 adults per infant to adequately meet their needs, and you've got 2 of them, or maybe 1.5, and he's gone half the day, then it's crazy. You just can't do it. And so not only is the child not getting their needs met, but the father is getting his wounds re-stimulated, and he goes and has an affair, or he becomes a workaholic, or throws himself into his work, or he's drinking, or who knows what form of addiction he follows that will get him his pain level reduced. It's self-medication because of this primal wound of disconnection that most of us in Western culture carry and don't even know. It took me 40 years to realize how disconnected I was, and I started looking around to notice I'm not the only one. I think even in medicine, the DSM classification of diseases, every one of those can be traced back to a failed connection at some point. And the fact that there's so many different numbers in the DSM, all these different classifications that insurance companies use, goes to prove the enormous creative powers of the human mind and body at finding different ways to creatively try to meet those unmet needs. Symptoms from illnesses, mental and physical, all of these different things that happen in our body. Our body basically reflects our unconscious. And I've studied medicine. I know all the mechanics of physiology and histology, but it's the underlying field as this energy. We talked about energy for years, my wellness energy system, but it goes back to the vitality, the liveness, the consciousness that imbues the whole universe. That's the connection field that we're all a part of. But the Newtonian mechanistic model ignores all that. It's just a series of machines interacting, and we know that doesn't work. I came up with the saying a few years ago that the currency of wellness is connection. I realized that everything I'd done for 30-some years all boiled down to connection. In the wellness workbook, it was wellness and eating, how we're connected to our food, how we're connected to our body, moving, our feelings, our thoughts, our ability to communicate, our senses, our breathing. It's all connection. That one concept of connection is crucial to everything. And I just spent 15 years looking at how connection is formed, and a wonderful book called The General Theory of Love, which actually is the general theory of connection. And the limbic system, the part of our brain that we don't think with, it's underneath the thinking part. It's the part, the mammalian brain, that resonates, that connects us with other people. And where does that connection begin? In the uterus, in the womb, in the connection with the mother, her emotions, her blood sugar, everything that the infant hears, how stressed she is if she and if the father are fighting. That connection then radically changes at birth when the umbilical cord is cut and you're having to breathe air, and you've been in a warm, contained environment where there's touch and movement and massage and all that, and suddenly you're lying still in a nursery bassinet or something like that, or left alone to sleep in a crib, That's a radical change of disconnection, and humans weren't designed for that. You don't see any other mammal leaving their infants alone. You see them all snuggled together. And this is a radical experiment that humans have been doing the last few hundred years that I think has had catastrophic outcomes, that we aren't connecting the dots. So there's these steps, these neurologic developmental steps that are important to go through, from being carried, eventually taking our first steps, the secure base, moving out from the secure base, but having a place to come back to as they explore the world, standard developmental things. But in American, or mainly Western raised kids, the level of connection at a subtle level, or the baseline level, is so much lower than in a culture where they do still treat them like mammals, that we still can't see it. And we don't even have data. When we were writing this book, we were trying to get this data. It's not there. Or if it's there, it's buried and no one has teased it out. So, but the crucial part is the infant period, and actually the in utero period, which still isn't getting the attention. There's only one or two organizations that address it. And it's largely, we think of these fetuses as lumps. We don't realize they can hear everything. They're feeling all the mother's emotions. They're engaged in the world much more than we realize, because we can't see them under the clothing and behind the skin. And so that environment in utero is so important, the most important factors in your later state of health. And here I was doing fitness and nutrition and stress reduction, all these wellness things. They don't count near as much as what that first 9 months in utero do, how your experience is then, if the mother's stressed or the father's off somewhere. Focusing on those 9 months, and then the extra gestational period, the second 9 months when they come out, when they're designed to be in arms and to sleep with you, and basically be connected with another human all the time. What you hear and see are distant senses, and it doesn't mean a lot to a baby. But the contact, the movement, and the smell of the mother's scent and the smell of the milk, all of those are how the baby is connected. And our nervous system development is dependent on that. And we try to separate them and put them in cribs and make them sleep alone and make them be independent, which has just the opposite effect. It makes them dependent because they didn't get those early needs met. They all feed into the dynamic of disappearing dads. It's going to show up later on when the father is giving birth to his first child. And what Prescott discovered, this was Mason and Berkson's study, is that the movement was essential to the development of the cerebellum, the development of the whole nervous system. And that's what we get when we're carried around. He then looked in the literature to see if he could verify that, doing a cross-cultural study, studied 49 tribes, 26 of whom were nonviolent and 23 were violent. And he found an 80% correlation with the tribes that carried their babies were nonviolent. If they didn't carry them, they were violent. And there was one other factor I won't go into that made it 100%. Two variables led to complete 100% nonviolent tribe. And this is amazing, and it really validates the whole idea of we need that connection. We need to be connected to a primary figure, the mother, the father, maybe a small cluster of people that share the carrying the baby. And if those early needs are met, the other important piece of it is breastfeeding and eye contact between the mother and the child. We're in a culture that's so radically disconnected, we don't even see it. And these other cultures can see it. When Jean Liedloff brought some Yakunas to the States, they were horrified at how American mothers treated their babies. They couldn't believe it. And there's a sense of connection, even though they're so-called primitive tribes and they don't have technology or not even necessarily literate. They have a sense of self and a presence and a connection that we Western-raised, disconnected people can only guess at. And we can do a lot to reconnect. Pan Leo's Connection Parenting book is the best source I know to help with kids that are school age or whatever, then the mothers or the parents are discovering that they're not that connected. A whole lot of ways to rebuild that connection. And back to this normative abuse idea again, which is central to, it's the central pathology of the issue of disappearing dads. And it begins with an unconscious conception. Often, kids aren't planned. So once you discover you're pregnant, to consciously nourish the little being that's growing there and being aware that it can hear you at age 6 weeks, that it's aware of every emotion the mother has, and the mother is aware of every emotion the father has. And so the harmony in the family, that's important. That's early in normative abuse of not recognizing that. The kind of prenatal care, how well the mother feels embraced by her community and connected and supported, which is common in village tribal situations. The birth itself, is it a natural phenomenon where there's now the concept of ecstatic birth has been made into a movie, as opposed to hospital births, which are a disaster for the most part. It's clearly not as safe to have birth in a hospital unless there's complications and they're well predictable. So having a birth that's a joyous experience rather than an ordeal that you're going to have to recover from. And then the early stages of taking care of the baby, doing things like keeping them intact. We're cutting the half or 3/4 of the nerve endings off of the little boys' penises routinely in the first 2 days. It used to be 80% were done, now it's down into the 30s. but it's still a tremendous trauma to the boy. His first sexual experience is violence, and he's lost 3/4 of his nerve endings, and then we wonder why Viagra is so popular. All of these things contribute, and we throw drops in their eyes, we take blood, heel sticks, all the traumatic things that are done to babies that shouldn't be done and don't need to be done then. Tremendous number of vaccinations, many of which are unnecessary in my opinion. The side effects aren't known, they haven't been adequately studied, and they're inventing more and more vaccines for doubtful conditions. That's another form of normative abuse. Then you throw in letting a kid cry themselves to sleep when they need to be in your arms constantly, and the feelings of abandonment that go with that, the bottle feeding, the scheduled feeding, all the different ways of separating a child from being in the skin-to-skin contact, carrying them around in lifeless containers. All of these things of how we treat babies that isn't how any other mammal would treat their babies. Well, I do think the dynamic of disappearing dads, there's so many different aspects to the symptoms of how it shows up of men having affairs, of anger and unsatisfactory ways that people are experiencing marriages, the high divorce rate, particularly after a child is born. All of these things are again symptoms of the underlying issue of disconnection. Well, in the book, we talk about the various ways that the dynamic of disappearing dads can be addressed, from the couple's relationship, from the man doing his own personal work, from the woman doing her personal work, creating community, changing the environment, all of the different aspects that go into this. And if we don't do this, disappearing dads are going to keep on happening.